In Greenwich, Connecticut, where old money whispers through ancient trees, Richard Sterling's mansion wasn't just a home. It was a fortress of glass and steel. It was a smart house, a genius house. With a soft-spoken word, the lights would dim, the temperature would adjust, and music would drift from unseen speakers like a ghost. The windows, vast sheets of glass overlooking acres of perfectly manicured lawns, could tint themselves against the afternoon sun. Everything worked. Everything was perfect. Everything except for the man who owned it. From his wheelchair, a marvel of modern engineering that cost more than most people's cars, Richard Sterling watched his perfect world function without him. He was the ghost in his own machine. The silence in the Sterling estate was a physical thing. It pressed in on you, broken only by the quiet whir of his chair on the polished marble floors or the sterile hum of the air filtration system. There were no sounds of family, no laughter echoing. In the cavernous hallways, just the cold, hard reality of a life that had come to a screeching halt. Richard would stare at the priceless paintings on the walls, works of art he'd conquered at auctions, trophies from a life of aggressive success, and feel nothing. They were just colors and shapes, as empty as the gardens outside, which grew lush and green for no one to walk in. He was a king who had built an empire, only to become a prisoner in his own castle. A castle where every perfect, automated convenience was a cruel joke, a daily reminder of all the simple things his own body could no longer do. He had once been a titan, a man whose voice could make markets tremble and grown men sweat. His face had been on the cover of Forbes, his name a synonym for power, for control. He believed in one God, himself. He was the master of his fate, the captain of his soul, and he had steered his life with an iron will. He built his world exactly as he wanted it, brick by expensive brick. Now that same iron will was trapped inside a body that refused to obey. The frustration was a fire in his gut, a constant burning rage that had nowhere to go. He would clench his fists, the only part of him that still answered his commands with full force, until his knuckles were white. He was drowning in wealth, suffocating in luxury. But the physical paralysis was nothing compared to the agony in his soul. It was a deeper break, a wound no doctor could see and no amount of money could ever hope to heal. He was utterly, completely, and terrifyingly alone. He remembered a time when silence was the one thing money couldn't buy, a time when his world was a symphony of ringing phones, urgent voices, and the steady, thrumming beat of an empire bending to his will. The memories came back not as gentle waves, but as violent, crashing breakers, pulling him under. He was back in the boardroom on the 80th floor, the city of New York sprawling beneath him like a map he owned. The air was thick with fear and expensive cologne. Across the polished mahogany table, a man twice his age was pleading, his face pale and sweating. "Richard, please," the man begged, his voice cracking. "This factory, it's been in my family for 3 generations. It's the lifeblood of an entire town." Richard Sterling leaned forward, his eyes as cold and hard as the glass tower that surrounded them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet words cut deeper than any shout. "And for 3 generations, your family has failed to innovate. You've become inefficient, a liability." He picked up a pen, a gold fountain pen worth more than the man's car, and tapped it once on the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "The market has no room for sentiment, Arthur. It only has room for profit. My people. What will I tell them?" Richard leaned back, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. It wasn't pity. It was the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen. "Tell them they should have worked for me." He slid the contract across the table. "Sign it, or I will crush you. I will buy your suppliers, poach your top talent, and undercut your prices until that factory is nothing but a Rust Belt relic. Your choice." Arthur's hand trembled as he reached for the pen. Richard Sterling didn't just win. He conquered. He left no survivors. That was his brand. That was the man on the cover of Forbes, his jaw set, the headline blazing in bold letters. The sterling standard, how one man redefined ambition. It was the man on the cover of Fortune, smiling a predator's smile, hailed as a master of the universe. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a force of nature, a titan who believed he could command the tides of fortune themselves. He believed his will was the only law that mattered. He built skyscrapers that scraped the heavens, but he never once looked up. Why would he? He thought the power was all down here, inside him, forged in his own mind, and wielded by his own hands. He saw faith as a crutch for the weak, prayer as a waste of valuable time. His God was the closing bell on Wall Street, and his only sacred text was his ever-growing balance sheet. He remembered the power, the intoxicating rush of it. He remembered the way people's eyes would shift when he entered a room, a mix of fear and awe. He was a king, and the world was his kingdom. He had a beautiful wife, Eleanor, who looked perfect on his arm at galas. He had a brother, David, who followed in his shadow. He had everything a man could ever want, and it still wasn't enough. He always needed more control, more power, more everything. Then came the rain. A Tuesday afternoon in October. He was in his custom-built German sports car, a silver bullet tearing down a winding Connecticut road. He was on the phone, of course, closing another deal, his voice sharp, impatient. He was yelling at someone, barking orders, his mind 1,000 miles away, already focused on the next victory. He didn't see the patch of wet leaves on the asphalt. He didn't see the curve that came up too fast. He didn't have time to think, to pray, to even curse. There was only the horrifying screech of tires losing their grip, a sound that ripped through the fabric of his perfect world. A gut-wrenching lurch as the laws of physics, the only laws he couldn't bully, took over. The world became a violent kaleidoscope of green trees and grey sky, spinning, spinning, spinning. Then came the sound, a brutal, deafening roar of metal twisting, of safety glass exploding into 1,000,000 tiny diamonds. It was the sound of a universe being unmade, his universe. And then silence. A different kind of silence, not the respectful hush of a boardroom, not the peaceful quiet of his empty mansion. It was a dead silence, the silence of a connection severed, of a power cord ripped from the wall. In that one catastrophic moment, the king was dethroned. The master of the universe became a prisoner in his own body. The booming voice that could make markets tremble was gone, replaced by the ghost of a memory, an echo of a fallen king trapped inside a broken shell. Richard's bitterness was a coiled snake in his chest, ready to strike at the slightest provocation. He was about to lash out, to tell this little girl to get out, to leave him alone in his misery. But then Anna Claire did something that silenced the rage in his throat. She simply got on her knees. The soft sound of her small legs meeting the cold, hard marble echoed in the cavernous room. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and without a trace of pity. "Kneel and pray with me," she said, her voice a soft whisper that carried more weight than any command he had ever given. The request was so absurd, so impossible, it was almost laughable. Kneel. He couldn't even feel his own legs. The word was a mockery of his entire existence. He opened his mouth to say so, to unleash the venom he felt, but she spoke again, her words cutting through his defenses. "You can kneel in your heart," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Jesus will make you stand up." Something inside him broke. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was exhaustion. He was too tired to fight, too tired to be angry, too tired to argue with the unshakable faith of a child. For the first time in months, Richard Sterling surrendered. He didn't nod, he didn't speak. He just closed his eyes, the darkness behind his lids a welcome. Relief from the gilded cage around him, and he listened. Anna Claire's prayer wasn't for a miracle. She didn't ask for legs to be healed or for fortunes to be restored. Her words were simpler, far more personal. "Jesus," she began, her voice earnest and small. "Please come and sit with Mr. Sterling. The nights are very long and he is very lonely. Please be his friend when everyone else is busy." She paused, then added, "Amen." That was it. No grand pronouncements, no desperate pleas, just a quiet invitation, a request for presence, not for a cure. In all the months since the crash, doctors had offered prognoses, lawyers had offered strategies, and his family had offered hollow platitudes. But no one had offered simple companionship. No one had named his deepest wound, the crushing, suffocating loneliness. The prayer wasn't about fixing his body, it was about seeing his soul. For the first time, Richard didn't feel like a problem to be solved or an asset to be managed. He felt seen. A tiny crack formed in the thick wall of cynicism he had built around his heart. Later that night, the automated system dimmed the lights, plunging the room into its usual oppressive darkness. This was always the worst time for Richard. Alone with his thoughts, the silence amplifying the hum of the machinery that kept him alive. But tonight, something was different. The child's simple words echoed in his mind. Please be his friend when everyone else is busy. He lay there, staring at the ceiling when he felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible tingling in his right foot. It was like the ghost of a touch, a whisper of a sensation in a limb that had been dead to him for months. His logical mind, the mind that had built an empire, immediately dismissed it. A phantom nerve firing, a meaningless spasm from a damaged spine. The doctors had warned him about these things, but he couldn't shake the feeling. He tried to replicate it, concentrating with all his might, but there was nothing. Still, the memory of that fleeting sensation lingered. It wasn't a miracle, it was just a flicker. But in a world of absolute darkness, even the smallest flicker can feel like the dawn. It was the first tiny tremor of hope. The days that followed began to change. The oppressive silence of the mansion felt different. Richard found himself listening for the sound of Maria's quiet footsteps, knowing her daughter was often with her. He started to watch them. He saw Maria and Anna Claire sharing a simple lunch in the staff kitchen, laughing over a sandwich cut into triangles. He saw the girl drawing pictures at the table while her mother hummed a soft tune. Their world was small, their possessions few, but their affection for each other was a wealth he couldn't begin to calculate. He contrasted it with his own life. Dinners with Eleanor had been transactional events, scheduled between board meetings and charity galas. Conversations with his brother David were a chess match of veiled intentions and corporate maneuvering. They valued him for his net worth, for the power his name carried. Maria and Anna Claire had nothing to gain from him, yet they offered kindness freely. He was beginning to understand that there was another kind of currency in the world, one based on love, faith, and grace. And in that currency, Richard Sterling was utterly bankrupt. His family began to notice the shift in his demeanor. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was there. A certain calmness had replaced the raw anger in his eyes. Eleanor and David would find him staring out the window, not with despair, but with a thoughtful expression. One afternoon, Eleanor walked in to hear him quietly humming a tune he'd overheard from the kitchen. It was David who first voiced their concern. "He seems distracted," he said to Eleanor in a hushed tone in the marble entryway, thinking Richard was out of earshot. "He's been spending too much time around the help," Eleanor replied, her voice laced with disdain. "I heard him talking to the little girl about prayer." The word sounded like a disease on her tongue. They didn't see healing. They saw weakness. They didn't see a man finding peace. They saw a vulnerable mind, susceptible to manipulation. Their fear was palpable, but it wasn't for Richard's well-being. It was for the Sterling fortune. What if this newfound religious fixation led him to do something foolish? What if he decided to give it all away to some church or charity? The whispers started then. Secret phone calls to family lawyers, quiet meetings in the city that were left off the calendar. They spoke in coded language, using terms like protecting his legacy and ensuring his long-term care. But the goal was simple and brutal. They were beginning to build a case that would argue that Richard Sterling, the titan of industry, was no longer of sound mind. The attack wasn't quiet. It began with whispers, then headlines on gossip websites, and finally, a segment on a national news program. Eleanor and David had moved swiftly, leaking carefully crafted stories to the press. The narrative they spun was both cruel and brilliant in its simplicity. Richard Sterling, the fallen titan, was now a vulnerable, broken man. He was being manipulated, they claimed, by a fanatical household staff who were filling his head with religious nonsense. His newfound interest in prayer wasn't a sign of healing. It was a symptom of a deteriorating mind, a tragic side, effect of his trauma. The battle for his soul was dragged out of the quiet mansion and into the harsh glare of public opinion. Richard watched it all from his chair, a prisoner in his own home, the television screen flickering with images of his own face, accompanied by words like unstable and concerning. His brother, David, gave a somber interview, his face a mask of feigned concern. "We're just worried about him," David said, looking directly into the camera. "We want to protect him, and protect the legacy he built." The legacy. It was always about the money, the empire. They weren't trying to save the man. They were trying to secure the assets. The final blow came on a Tuesday afternoon. A man in a cheap suit, a process server, stood at the magnificent front door. He handed Richard a thick manila envelope. Inside, the legal jargon was cold and sharp, each word a perfectly crafted dagger. It was a petition, filed by his wife and his brother, to have him declared mentally incompetent. The ultimate betrayal, printed in black and white. He read through the pages, his hands trembling slightly. Their entire case was built on his conversations with Anna Claire, his moments of quiet reflection. His first fragile steps toward faith were twisted into evidence of delusion. The document argued that his belief in the power of prayer, a belief kindled by an 8-year-old girl, was proof that he was no longer fit to manage his own affairs. The one spark of light in his suffocating darkness was being used as the very weapon to extinguish it for good. The man who once commanded boardrooms with a single word now had to prepare to defend his own sanity. He was still holding the papers when he heard the sound. Not a crash, but a soft thud from the hallway, followed by a gasp. He wheeled himself around the corner to see Maria Garcia, Anna Claire's mother, crumpled on the polished marble floor. Her cleaning cloth lay beside her, a small, forgotten square of white. Her eyes were closed, her face pale. The constant, quiet source of strength in the house, the woman who worked with such dignity and grace, was now terrifyingly still. Panic flared in Richard's chest, a hot, useless fire. He couldn't get to her, couldn't kneel beside her, couldn't do anything but shout for help, his voice echoing through the vast, empty mansion. The hours that followed were a blur of paramedics, hushed voices, and the wail of a distant siren. Maria was rushed to the hospital, leaving a void of fear in the silent house. The initial reports from the doctors were grim. It was a sudden, aggressive illness, something that had been hiding in her body, and the prognosis was not good. When Anna Claire returned from school, Richard had to be the one to tell her. He watched her small face, usually so bright with faith, crumble into confusion and terror. The foundation of her world had been ripped out from under her. That night, the little girl who had been his spiritual guide came to him, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a question that shattered Richard's heart. She stood beside his wheelchair, twisting the hem of her dress. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I prayed for you. I prayed for Jesus to be your friend, and I thought you were getting better in your heart." She looked up at him, tears welling. "Did I do something wrong? Is Jesus angry with me? Is that why my mummy is sick?" Her crisis of faith was a mirror to his own. Past cynicism, he saw in her innocent question all the doubts he had harbored for a lifetime. But now, Something had changed inside him. He couldn't let her fall into that darkness. This was his test. He had to move from being a student of faith to a defender of it. In a powerful reversal of their first meeting, Richard reached out and took her small hand. He wheeled himself closer until they were side by side, two souls adrift in a storm. And for the first time in his adult life, Sterling prayed out loud. It wasn't eloquent. His voice was rough, uncertain. He didn't have the practiced words of a lifelong believer. It was just a raw, honest plea, spoken into the quiet of the room. "God," he began, squeezing Anna Claire's hand, I don't really know what I'm doing, but this little girl, she taught me that you listen, and right now, she's scared. Her mom, Maria, she's a good woman. She needs your strength. Anna Claire needs your peace." He paused, taking a shaky breath. He didn't ask for a miracle. He didn't demand healing. He simply surrendered. "Whatever your will is, please don't let this little girl feel like she's alone. Please sit with her, like she asked you to sit with me." In praying for them, for their pain and their fear, he anchored his own fragile, burgeoning faith. Days crawled by, each one thick with uncertainty. The legal battle loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon, but all that mattered was the news from the hospital. And then the phone rang. It was Maria's doctor. Richard listened, his knuckles white as he gripped the receiver. The doctor sounded baffled, almost hesitant. Maria's condition, which had been rapidly deteriorating, had made a sudden, inexplicable turnaround. Her vital signs were stabilizing. The infection was receding. "We can't explain it," the doctor said, his voice laced with professional disbelief. "It's like a 1 in a million spontaneous remission. Medically, it makes no sense." But for Richard and Anna Claire, it made all the sense in the world. It wasn't a magic trick, it was an answer. It wasn't the loud, booming miracle he might have once demanded, but a quiet, profound whisper of grace in the middle of their darkest hour. The day of the hearing arrived, cold and sterile, much like the rooms in Richard's mansion. The courtroom was panelled in dark wood that seemed to absorb all the light. Eleanor and David sat on one side, their faces set like stone, flanked by a team of expensive lawyers. Their lead attorney spoke in a smooth, confident voice, painting a picture of Richard as a broken man, a fragile mind easily swayed by the simplistic fanaticism of his household staff. They used words like delusional and unstable, twisting his newfound peace into a symptom of incompetence. Every argument was a carefully crafted stone, meant to build a wall around Richard and his fortune, locking him away for their own protection. When it was Richard's turn to speak, a hush fell over the room. He wheeled himself before the judge, his body still, but his eyes were alive with a fire no one had seen in years. The voice that came out was not the booming shout of the old CEO, nor the bitter whisper of the broken man. It was calm. It was steady. It was filled with an authority that didn't come from a stock portfolio, but from a place of deep, settled peace. "Your Honor," he began, "my family is right about one thing. I am not the man I was." He looked directly at Eleanor, then at David. There was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet sadness. "The man I was built an empire of glass and steel, but he lived in a prison of his own making. He was rich, but he was bankrupt in spirit. He was powerful, but he was a slave to his own pride." He paused, letting the words settle. "They say my faith is a delusion, but this faith, it's the first real thing I've felt in my entire life. It didn't come from a book or a sermon. It came from the simple, honest prayer of a little girl who saw a lonely man, not a millionaire. She taught me that true strength isn't about controlling everything around you. It's about having the courage to surrender, to kneel." His voice was clear and strong. "I have found a clarity I never knew existed, a purpose that has nothing to do with market shares, and a peace that no amount of money can buy." The judge, an older woman with tired eyes, looked past the wheelchair. She didn't see a broken man. She saw a man who had been shattered and then put back together stronger than before. The case was dismissed before lunch. Richard Sterling was, for the first time in his life, truly a free man. His first act of freedom was not revenge. It was a demolition. The very next day, he called an emergency meeting with his board and financial team. They expected him to rage, to fire everyone who had sided with David. Instead, he wheeled into the conference room he once ruled and gave a single quiet order. "Sell it," he said. They stared, confused. "Sell what, Mr. Sterling?" his top advisor asked. "All of it," Richard replied. "The holding companies, the aggressive investment arms, the parts of this empire built on breaking others down. Liquidate it. I'm tearing down the old kingdom." A wave of shock rippled through the room. This wasn't business, it was blasphemy. But Richard was resolute. "My new work," he announced, "won't be building skyscrapers that block out the sun. It will be building homes that let the light in." He told them about his plan for a new foundation, one inspired by a little girl who knew how to pray. And so the work began. Richard poured his energy, his fortune, and his very soul into creating the Clarity Homes. He was on construction sites in a modified all-terrain wheelchair, arguing with architects about the importance of natural light and warm colors. He personally approved every detail, from the soft blankets on the beds to the smell of fresh bread he insisted be baked in each kitchen daily. These were not institutions, they were homes, places of warmth, safety, and dignity, everything his own gilded cage had never been. He found a new reason to get up in the morning, a purpose that fired his soul in a way no billion-dollar deal ever had. The project became a living testament to his transformed heart. But as he was building these homes for others, he was also undertaking the grueling task of rebuilding his own. Parallel to his foundation work, he committed to a brutal physical rehabilitation regimen. There was no single dramatic miracle. There was only slow, agonizing work. It was hours of pain, sweat, and setbacks. It was the frustration of a mind willing a body that would not obey. But faith was now intertwined with effort. He would pray with Maria before each session, not for a cure, but for strength. And slowly, impossibly, things began to change. A flicker in a toe, the strength to push himself up on parallel bars, his arms shaking violently. Years passed. The world saw the Clarity Homes opening one by one, but few saw the private war Richard was waging. Until one day, gripping a walker with white knuckles, he took his first, halting step, then another. Each one a monumental victory, a testament to faith combined with relentless, stubborn will. Several years later, the sun is setting over a beautiful garden. Children's laughter fills the air, a sound of pure joy. Richard Sterling, now walking slowly but steadily with the help of a single cane, stands beside a teenage Anna Claire. They watch the children play on a swing set he designed himself. He is older, his face lined with the effort of his journey, but his eyes are full of light. "The doctors still talk about my case at medical conferences," he says, his voice a gentle rumble. "They call it a 1-in-a-million recovery, a medical marvel." He looks down at his own 2 feet, standing firm on the soft grass. Then he looks at Anna Claire, his expression full of a gratitude that words could never capture. "But we know the truth, don't we?" he says softly. "The real miracle wasn't learning to stand up from that chair. The real miracle was learning how to kneel my heart. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in rising up, but in the willingness to be brought to your knees. It is in those moments of surrender that we often find the grace to truly stand." Richard braced himself, his eyes shut tight. He expected the usual performance, a child's sing-song plea for God to fix the broken man, to make his legs move again, to shower him with blessings. He had heard it all before at charity galas and holiday events, empty words from people who wanted something from him. He steeled his heart for the familiar hollow ring of a prayer that was really just a wish list sent up to the sky. But what came from Anna Claire's lips was not a performance. It was a whisper, so quiet and personal it seemed to fill the vast, cold room. "Hi, Jesus," she began, her voice soft and clear as if she were talking to a friend sitting right there on the marble floor with her. "It's me, Anna Claire. I'm here with Mr. Sterling." She paused, taking a small breath. "He can't kneel on the outside, but his heart is kneeling right now. I can feel it." Richard's jaw tightened. How could she possibly know that? Then her prayer took a turn he never could have anticipated. "Jesus," she continued, "I'm not going to ask you to make his legs work. The doctors are trying to do that." Another pause. "But I was thinking maybe you could just come and sit with him for a while. The nights here are very long and the house is so quiet. I think he is very lonely." The words struck Richard with the force of a physical blow. Lonely. She didn't say broken or angry or pitiful. She said lonely. A simple, devastating truth that no one else had ever dared to speak aloud. His wife, Eleanor, spoke of his frustration. His brother, David, spoke of his difficult adjustment. His doctors used clinical terms like social isolation. But this little girl, with the wisdom only a child can possess, had looked past the wheelchair, past the billion-dollar fortune, and seen the raw, gaping wound in his soul. "Please be his friend when everyone else is busy," Anna Claire whispered. "You don't have to talk. Just sitting with someone is enough sometimes, so they know they're not invisible." Amen. And that was it. No grand finale, no dramatic appeal for a miracle, just a simple, profound request for presence, for companionship. The prayer wasn't about fixing his body, it was about tending to his spirit. It reframed God, not as some cosmic vending machine that dispenses miracles, but as an intimate friend who shows up to sit with you in the dark. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the empty, oppressive silence of before. It was a stillness filled with the echo of her words. Richard kept his eyes closed, his mind reeling. For his entire life, he had viewed the world and everyone in it as a series of transactions. You give something, you get something. Even faith, as he understood it, was transactional. You pray, you sacrifice, you get your reward. But this was something else entirely. It was a gift with no strings attached, an offering of comfort with no expectation of a return. He felt a strange sensation, a loosening in his chest, like a band of steel that had been wrapped around his heart for years was finally beginning to give way. It wasn't faith. He was still Richard Sterling, the cynic, the pragmatist. He didn't suddenly believe a celestial being was on its way to his living room, but for the first time since the accident, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt seen, truly seen, not as a patient, a problem, or a portfolio, but as a man, a lonely man. He heard the soft rustle of fabric as Anna Claire stood up, then the quiet footsteps of her mother, Maria, entering the room. "Anna Claire, Mija, it is time to go home." There was no fuss, no lingering looks of pity. Maria simply helped her daughter with her small coat, their movements efficient and gentle. Richard finally opened his eyes. He watched them leave. Two small figures disappearing down the long, polished hallway, leaving him alone once more. But the loneliness felt different now. The crushing weight of it had lifted, just slightly. The prayer had left a crack in the thick wall of his cynicism, a tiny fissure letting in a sliver of unexpected light. He looked around the cavernous room, at the priceless art on the walls and the floor-to-ceiling windows showing the perfectly manicured lawns. For years, these things had been his gods. They were symbols of his power, his control. Now, they just looked like things, cold, silent, and utterly incapable of sitting with him through a long night. A little girl's whisper had just shown him a currency he never knew existed, and in that world, he was the poorest man on earth. The night fell over the Sterling estate like a heavy blanket, muffling the world in a sterile silence. For Richard, this was the hardest time. During the day, there were distractions, nurses, physical therapists, the drone of the television. But at night, alone in his sprawling, automated bedroom, There was nothing but the hum of the climate control and the relentless weight of his own thoughts. He lay perfectly still, a prisoner under thousand thread-count sheets, staring at the ceiling where faint shadows danced from the security lights outside. The loneliness was a physical presence, a cold spot in the center of the bed where his wife used to sleep. Tonight, however, a new sound echoed in the silence of his mind. It wasn't the ghost of a business deal or the memory of a roaring engine. It was the whisper of a child's prayer. "Please come and sit with Mr. Sterling. He is very lonely." The words circled, simple and strange. He had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something. From him, his money, his power, his name. No one had ever simply asked for someone to sit with him. He tried to dismiss it, to file it away as the naive rambling of a little girl who didn't understand the world. But the words wouldn't go away. They were too honest, too pure. He closed his eyes, a familiar wave of bitterness washing over him. What a joke! A titan of industry, brought low, now finding his only comfort in the prayer of a housekeeper's daughter. He felt a surge of his old anger, the raw frustration that was his constant companion. He was Richard Sterling. He didn't need a divine friend. He needed his legs. He needed his life back. He clenched his fists, the only part of his body that still obeyed him with perfect precision, the knuckles white and straining against the silk sheets. And then it happened. It wasn't a jolt. It wasn't a miracle. It was smaller than that, quieter, a flicker, deep within the deadened nerves of his right foot, buried under the weight of the blankets. He felt something, a faint, buzzing tingle, like the ghost of a limb that had fallen asleep. It lasted for only a second, maybe two, a tiny, electric whisper in a place that had been silent for months. His eyes snapped open. His heart hammered against his ribs. He held his breath, waiting, concentrating with an intensity he hadn't felt since he was in a boardroom closing a billion-dollar merger. He focused all his will, all his consciousness on that single point at the end of his leg. "Do it again," he commanded silently. "Move, feel, do something." Nothing. The foot remained as it always was, a numb, useless weight at the end of his body. The moment was gone, as fleeting as a dream upon waking. Richard let out a ragged breath, a harsh, guttural sound in the quiet room. His mind, the sharp, analytical tool that had built an empire, immediately supplied the answer. A phantom nerve impulse, a misfire in the tangled wiring of his damaged spine. The doctors had warned him about this. They called it paresthesia, a common side effect of his injury. It meant nothing. It was a neurological trick, a cruel echo of a system that was permanently broken. He repeated the words to himself like a mantra. It's nothing. It's a trick. It means nothing. He was a man of facts, of figures, of tangible results. He didn't believe in ghosts, and he certainly didn't believe in divine intervention sparked by a child's prayer. To believe that would be to admit weakness, to surrender to delusion, and he was not weak, not yet. But as the hours crept by and the first pale light of dawn began to touch the edges of the blackout curtains, he couldn't shake the memory of the sensation. He had experienced phantom pains before, sharp, stabbing jolts of agony from limbs that couldn't feel. This was different. It hadn't been pain. It had been a signal. A question. It felt less like a misfire and more like a single, hesitant knock on a door that had been sealed shut for a very long time. He lay there watching the light grow, the anger slowly draining away, replaced by a profound and unsettling confusion. He didn't feel hope. Hope was a dangerous, foolish thing. But for the first time since the world had shattered around him, he felt a crack in the certainty of his despair. A single, tiny tremor had run through the foundations of his miserable prison. And in the dead silence of his soul, he wondered just for a moment if someone had actually heard that little girl's prayer. Tuske. Days that followed felt different. The oppressive silence of the mansion was still there, but Richard was no longer listening to it. Instead, he found himself listening for something else. the soft squeak of Maria's cleaning cart, the distant sound of her humming a quiet melody, the light, quick footsteps of Anna Claire returning from school. He began to watch them, not as an employer observing his staff, but as a castaway watching a ship he never knew was sailing so close to his deserted island. He saw Maria pause to straighten a crooked painting, her touch gentle, respectful. He saw her polish the silver with a care that went beyond her job description. It was a quiet dignity, a respect for the work of her own hands. He noticed the small, worn wooden cross she wore on a simple chain around her neck. It was a stark contrast to the diamond necklaces Eleanor wore to galas. Maria's cross wasn't an accessory, it was an anchor. Richard had spent his life accumulating assets, things that appreciated in value. He looked at that simple piece of wood and realized he was looking at something truly priceless, something whose value couldn't be calculated on a spreadsheet. It represented a wealth he didn't understand, a peace that all his billions couldn't purchase. He saw how she would sometimes touch it unconsciously, a brief, fleeting gesture of reassurance, as if drawing strength from an invisible well. One afternoon, Anna Claire sat at the massive kitchen island, her small legs dangling far from the floor, carefully coloring in a workbook while her mother wiped down the granite countertops. Richard had positioned his wheelchair in the adjoining living area, pretending to read a financial report, but he was listening to every word. "Mija, how was school?" Maria asked, her voice soft. "It was good, Mama. We learned about the stars. Did you know some of them are gone, but we can still see their light?" Maria smiled. "Yes, sometimes the best things leave a light that shines long after they are gone." The conversation was so simple, so pure. There was no agenda, no hidden meaning. It was just love, expressed in a shared moment over crayons and countertops. Richard thought of his own conversations with his wife, Eleanor. They were negotiations. Every word was weighed, measured for its potential gain or loss. Her calls were always about board meetings, social obligations, or the performance of their stock portfolio. "The board is concerned about your prolonged absence, Richard. We have the charity ball on Friday. I'll issue a statement about your health. David thinks we should sell our shares in the tech firm." It was the language of commerce, not connection. His own family saw him as a line item, a damaged asset whose value was plummeting. They moved around him with a calculated concern that felt colder than outright neglect. David would visit, his eyes scanning the room, assessing the art on the walls, even as he asked about Richard's physical and therapy. His questions were a formality, a box to be checked before he could pivot to the real topic, the company. "Are you sure you're up to making these decisions, Richard? Maybe you should let me handle the quarterly reports for now." Every interaction was a transaction. They gave him feigned sympathy in exchange for power, for control, for a piece of his empire. And in that sterile, silent mansion, Richard Sterling finally understood. He was the richest man he knew, and he was utterly, devastatingly poor. He was spiritually bankrupt. The currency that mattered in the quiet world of Maria and Anna Claire wasn't the dollar. It was faith. It was grace. It was the simple, unshakable love between a mother and her child. He had spent his entire life mastering a language that meant nothing here. He could buy companies, bend markets to his will, and build skyscrapers that touched the clouds, but he couldn't buy a single moment of the genuine peace he saw in his housekeeper's eyes. He watched as Anna Claire finished her drawing. She slid off the stool and ran to her mother, holding up the paper with pride. It was a picture of a smiling sun radiating bright yellow lines. Maria stopped her work, dried her hands, and knelt to look at the drawing as if it were a masterpiece. "Oh, Anna Claire," she whispered, her voice thick with love. "It's beautiful. It makes my heart feel warm." She hugged her daughter tightly, a hug that seemed to shield them both from the coldness of the world. Richard felt a tightness in his chest, an ache that had nothing to do with his injuries. It was the feeling of profound, soul-crushing loneliness. For the first time, he didn't want to command or control. He just wanted to connect. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet space. Maria and Anna Claire turned, surprised. He felt a flicker of his old, arrogant self-consciousness, but he pushed it down. He looked past Maria and directly at her daughter. "Anna Claire," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. May I see your drawing?" The little girl's eyes widened. She looked at her mother, who gave a slight, encouraging nod. Anna Claire walked cautiously toward the man in the wheelchair, the titan of industry, and held out her simple drawing of the sun. Richard took it with a hand that trembled slightly. He looked at the crayon lines, so full of life and innocence, and in that moment, holding that piece of paper, he felt richer than he ever had in his entire life. It was his first investment in a currency he was only just beginning to understand. But this new currency was not traded on any stock exchange, and it made those who only dealt in dollars and cents deeply uncomfortable. Eleanor and David Sterling began to notice the change in Richard. The dark cloud of bitterness that had hung over him for months was starting to part, replaced by a quiet calm they couldn't comprehend. They saw him listening to Anna Claire, a small smile touching his lips. They overheard him asking Maria about her church. To them, this wasn't healing. It was a symptom of a deeper sickness, a dangerous vulnerability. In hushed, urgent conversations in the west wing of the mansion, a plan began to form. "He's not thinking clearly," David insisted, his voice a low hiss. "This religious phase, the maid and her daughter are influencing him. He could give everything away." Eleanor, her face a mask of practiced concern, nodded in agreement. "He needs protection," she said, though her eyes betrayed that it was the fortune she wanted to protect, not the man. They saw his newfound peace as a sign of weakness, a crack in the armor they could exploit. They met with their lawyers, men in sharp suits, who spoke of legal instruments like conservatorship and diminished capacity. The conspiracy was no longer a whisper, it was a carefully drafted legal strategy. The attack was swift and brutal. It began with curated leaks to gossip columns and financial news outlets. Anonymous sources close to the family expressed grave concern for Richard Sterling's mental state. The narrative they spun was cruel. The titan of industry, broken by his accident, was now being manipulated by his household staff. His faith wasn't a comfort, it was evidence of his delusion. Then, one cold afternoon, a courier delivered a thick envelope. Inside was the ultimate betrayal. Legal papers, officially petitioning the court to declare him mentally incompetent. The central argument rested on his relationship with Anna Claire and his sudden interest in prayer. The very thing that was saving his soul was being used as a weapon to strip him of his freedom. The man who once controlled a global empire now had to fight for control of his own mind. Just as Richard was steeling himself for this battle, a different kind of shadow fell over the house. A sudden, piercing cry echoed from the kitchen. Maria Garcia, the quiet, steady heart of the home, had collapsed. She was rushed to the hospital, her body overwhelmed by a sudden aggressive illness the doctors couldn't immediately identify. The prognosis was grim. The one source of unwavering strength in the house was now fighting for her life, and her daughter, Anna Claire, was thrown into a terrifying storm of confusion. For the first time in her young life, Anna Claire's perfect faith was cracked. She couldn't understand. She had prayed for Mr. Sterling, and she saw the light returning to his eyes. Why would Jesus let this happen to her mother? One evening she crept into Richard's study, her small face streaked with tears, her body trembling. She looked up at the man in the wheelchair, her voice barely a whisper. "Did I do something wrong, Mr. Sterling? I prayed so hard. Is Jesus angry with me?" The question, so full of innocent pain, pierced Richard's heart more than any legal document ever could. In that moment he knew he could no longer be a passive observer of faith. He had to become a participant. He wheeled himself closer, his hands, which once signed billion-dollar deals, now gently taking her tiny, trembling one. He looked into her frightened eyes and, for the first time since the accident, Richard Sterling prayed out loud. His voice was rusty, uncertain at first, but it grew stronger with every word. It wasn't a prayer for himself. It was a raw, honest plea to God. "God," he began, "I don't know much about this, but this little girl, she has been your faithful soldier. She needs you now. Her mother, Maria, she needs you. I'm not asking you to fix this for me. I'm asking you to be with them. Give Maria strength. Give Anna Claire peace. Whatever happens, whatever your will is, just give us the grace to face it." In that prayer of complete surrender, offered for someone else, Richard's own faith was forged into something unbreakable. Days turned into a week of tense waiting. Then the phone rang. It was the hospital. Richard listened, his knuckles white. As he gripped the receiver, Maria's condition had made a sudden dramatic turnaround. The infection that had been raging through her body was inexplicably receding. The doctors were stunned. They used words like baffling and 1 in a million spontaneous remission. They had no medical explanation, but in the quiet of the Sterling mansion, Richard and Anna Claire knew. It wasn't magic, it was an answer, not to a demand, but to a surrender. And it became the unshakable bedrock of everything. That was to come. The day of the competency hearing arrived. The courtroom was cold and impersonal. Eleanor and David's lawyers presented their case with clinical precision, painting a picture of a brilliant man now lost in a fog of religious fantasy. They presented his conversations with an 8-year-old girl as evidence of his regression. When it was Richard's turn to speak, a hush fell over the room. He didn't have his powerful stride, but as he spoke from his wheelchair, his voice carried an authority no one had heard in years. It was calm, clear, and devoid of anger. He didn't deny his faith, he owned it. He spoke of being a king in a golden cage, of being spiritually bankrupt despite his immense wealth. He told them about a little girl who taught him that kneeling in his heart was more powerful than standing on top of the world. "My family believes I have lost my mind," he said, his eyes finding the judges. "The truth is, for the first time in my life, I am finally finding it." The judge, a woman who had seen every kind of human drama, saw not a broken man, but a man made whole. The case was dismissed. Richard's first act as a free man was not one of revenge. It was an act of creation. He called a meeting with his financial team. The ruthless, predatory executives who had helped him build his empire sat in stunned silence as he gave his new orders. He instructed them to begin liquidating key assets of Sterling Industries, the cold, steel, and glass symbols of his old life. "We're no longer in the business of building skyscrapers," he announced. "We're going to build safe havens." He was creating a foundation, a network of homes for abandoned and at-risk children. He would call them the Clarity Homes, in honor of the clarity he had been given. The work became his new life. He poured his energy, his fortune, and his heart into it. He was on every conference call, reviewing every blueprint, ensuring each home was filled with light, warmth, and love, everything his own mansion had lacked. For the first time, he was building something that would outlast him, something that had a purpose beyond a balance sheet. He was creating a legacy, not of wealth, but of worth. Parallel to building his foundation, he began a new private battle. He committed to a grueling physical rehabilitation program. There was no single cinematic miracle. There was only pain, sweat, and relentless grinding work. It was a testament to faith in action. The spiritual healing gave him the will to endure the physical torment. Months bled into years. We see him in montage, the first flicker of movement in his toes, the agonizing effort to stand between parallel bars, his body shaking with exertion. We see him take his first halting step with a walker, his face a mixture of agony and triumph. Each small victory was a monumental achievement, a step away from the man he was. The final scene takes place 5 years later. The sun is setting over a beautiful garden, filled with the sounds of children laughing. This isn't the sterile, manicured lawn of the Greenwich estate. This is the garden of the first Clarity home. Richard Sterling is standing in the middle of it all, leaning lightly on a single wooden cane. He is watching the children play. Beside him stands a teenage Anna Claire, her eyes still holding that same deep well of wisdom. He turns to her, a gentle smile on his face. "The doctors still call it a medical marvel," he says, his voice soft. "They can't explain how I'm standing here today." He looks out at the children, then back at her. "But we know, don't we? The real miracle wasn't learning to stand up from a wheelchair. The real miracle was learning how to kneel." Stories like this remind us that our greatest strength is often found not in our power, but in our surrender. They show us that sometimes we must be brought to our knees before we can truly learn how to stand. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need to hear this message of hope. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire the soul. We love reading your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. And what would you do in Richard's place? What does it mean to you to learn how to stand? Until we meet again for our next story, this is your friend Valentino wishing you peace and clarity.